Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Kabbalah Cafe, and thank you for joining. Thank you for being here with us. And I want to begin today with this is lesson number 285. Thank you again for being here, and want to begin today with a little story. They say there was once a movie director, and this movie director was creating this big battle scene. And it was a very expensive scene to put on. Lots of different actors, lots of different moving pieces, and the backdrops and the scenery and the different props. And it was very important, very imperative that he be able to catch this scene in the best possible way and not to miss any of the angles. And so he hires 3 different cameramen to take this scene. He has an Italian camera crew, and cameraman. He has a French cameraman. He has a Jewish fellow. And they've all got their cameras, different angles. The scene goes off. It's a wild battle scene. And unfortunately, during the battle scene, the French cameraman is completely trampled by some horses. Then the Italian cameraman is toppled over by some cannons that they pulled over. And the poor movie director goes out and he sees that he's missing these different these individuals have unfortunately been trampled on. They've missed the scene, and he sees the Jewish fellow is still standing. He says, okay, from a distance, he calls him and he says, did you get it? Did you get the scene? And this Jewish fellow looks up at him and he says, I'm ready whenever you are. So sometimes in life, there are windows of opportunity. Life gives us windows of opportunity, and we have to make sure that we don't miss those windows, that we don't lose out and miss those opportunities that life presents us. We have to, as they say, we have to seize the day, we have to seize the moments. And through all this unfortunate tragedy that we're facing and difficulty and crisis in the world, and it's very sad to see the human toll and the tragedy, at the same time, for many of us, there are opportunities. There are opportunities that we can seize. And for many of us, there's an unprecedented opportunity when it comes to the time that we have. Many of us have been given, not by choice, but have been given a kind of a sabbatical. We're in isolation, many of us quarantine. We've changed our daily schedules. A lot of us are spending more time at home. And this sabbatical, in a sense, gives us an opportunity to really be reflecting and to be thinking about to rethink life, to really maybe rethink our priorities. It gives us an opportunity to step away from the rut that we've been in. And we've had this extended sabbatical where we really have an opportunity for reflection, for introspection, to think about our lives and to think about what we want from life, what it is that we're trying to achieve in life. And it's really an opportunity for focusing more on spirituality and spiritual growth. And I think it's important that we discuss this a little bit because the Kabbalistic teachings and insights, especially as they're elucidated and illuminated in Hasidic philosophy, give us tremendous insights and tremendous guidance in how we can achieve greater spiritual success in our journey. Now, conventionally, when people think about spiritual growth or a spiritual journey, they would feel that what's important is to become more knowledgeable, more enlightened, and through this, a greater state of spiritual inspiration, which would somehow dictate and somehow lift up and really, in many ways, transform the way we live on a daily basis. How we think, how we talk, how we behave, that this would change us and this would lift us up. It would lift us make us a more spiritual people. So again, it's about being more knowledgeable, being enlightened, being inspired, and living a higher life. And this is how we would conventionally understand this, the concept of spiritual growth and spirituality. So I'd like to share maybe a slightly different perspective today, something that is a little bit not what we would expect from the Kabbalah's view. Of course, many of us are getting ready for Passover, just a few days to go to Passover, and Passover being a key holiday for the Jewish people, the most ancient of our holidays, and a holiday that's teeming with, filled with tremendous amounts of meaning and inspiration. It's interesting that here and there, when the Torah describes the events that led to the Exodus, it switches from the past tense, which is what the Torah usually uses when it describes the events of the past, when it describes the Exodus. And we sometimes find it switching into a present tense. For example, when it speaks about the Jewish people originally descending into Egypt, it says, these are the names of the Jewish people, Haba'im Mitzrayma, which in the Hebrew means that are coming into Egypt, not that came into Egypt, which is what you would expect, but that are coming in the present tense into Egypt. And the reason for this is because the concept of Egypt and the concept of the enslavement in Egypt, and then the subsequent liberation from Egypt, as we've said many times before, isn't just an event that took place many years ago in history, but it is symbolic of a daily, really spiritual journey that each of us are supposed to be on. Leaving Egypt is the story of life. As we've said many times before, that in Hebrew, the word for Egypt is connected and is related in Hebrew to the word for limitation, inhibition, restriction. And all of us in life face certain aspects of life that limit us, certain habits, attitudes, mindsets, fears, anxieties, addictions, whatever they may be, emotional, mental, physical, limitations, things that hold us back in life. And of course, most of those limitations are within ourselves. There's a famous saying about the fellow who looks at the mirror every day, and on his mirror, he's got a sticker. And on that sticker, it says, you're looking at the only problem you're going to face all day today. And that's because most of the problems of life are self-imposed. They're self-imposed limitations, self-imposed fears and habits and so on and so forth and perspectives. And the journey of life is really the journey out of Egypt, how we get out of those restrictions. We do this every day, which is why we mention the Exodus in our prayers every day. But it is also highlighted during a certain season of the year. And this is the season, this season, as we get ready for Passover and we celebrate Passover, is the season in which we really highlight this concept of leaving Egypt, leaving our own personal Egypt. Interesting to note on this concept that the word for Egypt in Hebrew, not only does it mean limitation, but really the word is Mitzrayim. Mitzrayim, which is the Hebrew word for Egypt, can also be read as Meitzar Yam. Meitzar Yam means the limitation of Yam. Yam can mean sea, but in Hebrew, the word Yam also is the Hebrew letters Yud and Mem. You don't worry about all the details now. The main thing is the concept. Yud and Mem in Hebrew have numerical values. Yud is 10, Mem is 40. 40 plus 10 is 50. So we're told that Egypt represents a limitation, Meitzar, a limitation Yam of the 50. What are the 50? We're told there are 50 gates from a person's intellect to their emotions. Generally speaking, when we speak about intellect and emotions, as we've said many times before, in Kabbalah, it speaks about intellect as the parents and the emotions as the children, as the babies. Just like babies, children have to be conceived and given birth to in the physical world, so too emotions are born. Emotions are given birth to, and they're given birth to through our intellect, through our mind, through our perspective. The way we understand life, the way we see life, the way we look at a situation is going to affect the way we feel about it. Even emotions that we seem to feel that we have no control over or just seem to be intrinsic is usually because of some kind of experience we've had sometime in our lifetime that has molded the way we see something, and even if it's subconsciously in some way has impacted us in such a way that it gives us those emotions. Sometimes that's why we have to spend time in therapy, cognitive therapy, digging, looking back, trying to find out, where did I get this blockage from? Where do I have this emotional baggage from? Where's it coming from? What happened to me that gave me this perspective, this understanding that led to this emotion? But every emotion has to come from some kind of intellectual perspective. And when we're trying to change our emotions, we have to use our mind cognitively to change the way we feel. And the transition from the mind to the emotions are called the gates. Just like a gate, what is the concept of a gate? The concept of a gate is how you transition from one place to another place. So you have one area and you have another area, and you have the gate, the doorway between the two. So too, from the world of intellect to the world of emotions, there are gates. Generally speaking, we talk about 7 emotions in Kabbalah. Kabbalah says every person is made of 7 basic emotions, many more sub-emotions, but 7 basic emotions. Each one of those 7 is divided by, it has within it the other 7. So there are 49 sub-emotions. And then we have an intrinsic, so to speak, understanding that transcends those emotions. So that's the 50th. And that's why there are 50 gates from the intellect to the emotions. And when we talk about Mitzrayim, means that for some reason there's a blockage that's not allowing us to take things from the intellect to our emotions. And many people struggle with this, where they know what the right thing to do is, they have the right perspective, but they can't seem to get themselves inspired enough to actually do it. And that's a blockage. There's a blockage there in the gates between the intellect and the emotions, which is this state of Egypt, right? So many people, if you ask them, don't you believe you should be taking better care of your health? Don't you think you should be exercising? Don't you think you should? And many people say, I know I ought to this and I ought to that and I ought to that. But going from the intellect to the emotions to being inspired enough to do it is where a lot of us struggle. But again, the concept of leaving Egypt is a daily concept. It's the story of life. And in many ways, it's not only the story of our own personal lives, but in Kabbalah, it's understood to be the story of our world, of the history of the world. The story of our world is a story of a world that finds itself limited, constricted in many ways, primitive in many ways, because of the way human beings behave, human beings understand and behave and live, and so on and so forth, how we treat each other, how we treat the world around us. And these restrictions and limitations and the primitive life that human beings live, we're supposed to be growing and transcending and trying to break those limitations. So for example, whereas 3,000 years ago, when the Torah was given initially to the Jewish people, the concepts of freedom, liberty, the concepts of the sanctity of life, every human being is created in the image of God, the concept of equality, the concept of human rights, those were concepts that didn't even have words in the vocabulary of mankind. They certainly weren't on the in the mind of mankind. Concept of charity, goodness. The pagan world did not have those concepts. The words didn't even exist in their vocabulary. And the idea is that to break out of those limitations, to break out of those constrictions, and to slowly but surely try to create a world where at least we can talk about freedom, where at least we can talk about equality, justice, truth, even if it's not something that is perfectly upheld and perfectly practiced, but the concept that we can break out of those limitations and begin to learn, understand, and to teach, and for these concepts to become widely accepted, whether it's the abolishment of slavery, women's rights, equality, and respect for others, and so on and so forth, ideas and concepts and attitudes and behaviors that slowly but surely change and allow us to overcome the limitations that we face in our world. And so really, Kabbalah sees the world as going from a place of constriction and limitation, and slowly but surely breaking out of those restrictions and limitations. And that's Judaism's concept of this belief and this, so to speak, vision of a better future, of a brighter future, that the world can develop, it can become better, and that we hope and pray and aspire to and work towards a future that is more enlightened, a future that is more peaceful, a future in which human beings live for higher pursuit, in which they respect each other, there is peace, there is equality, there is truth, there is justice. That is the way that Jewish history understands, though Judaism and Kabbalah understands history. It's a journey from the restrictions and from those limitations, and to break out of those limitations. I'm going to unmute for a moment just to see if there's any questions at this time, and then we can we'll go from there. So if anyone has questions, now would be a time. If you have a question, you can ask us a question. You need clarification on anything. Chance for me to sip my coffee.
Rabbi, what was the 50th thing when you said, I got the 49, you went fast to the 50th.
So basically there is the 49 different specific gates that deal with specific understandings that we have related to those emotions. And then there's, so to speak, the subconscious knowledge that we have. We have conscious knowledge and subconscious knowledge, and that subconscious knowledge also has an impact on our being, and that's what the 50th gate represents, the subconscious that transcends the 49. And that's why, for example, you have 49 days between the first day of Passover and the Jewish people receiving the Torah at Shavuot. The 50th day is Shavuot, when they receive this higher knowledge. So you have that 49 plus that 50th, which is that 50th level. It's interesting to note, by the way, that someone who's missing any aspect of this is incomplete. And physically, when you're missing something and incomplete, we say that a person is not well, they're sick. And if you take the word choleh, which is a sick person in Hebrew, its numerical value is 49, which means it's missing one piece. And when you're missing something, you're not well. And that's why the numerical value for someone who's sick, who's not well, is choleh 49. Other questions?
So 45 would be missing 5.
Any other questions?
What specific religious guidance does Judaism offer us to move from the intellect to the through these emotional gates?
Okay, to get your mind to be more in control of your emotions.
Well, to move through those gates.
Oh, to move through the gates. Okay, so what happens when those gates are not opened could be for various reasons, but usually the reason is because we are too comfortable and too coarse in our present and too set in our present habits, and we need to somehow break those gates open. And so sometimes the way that's done is through a process of humility. We need to be more humble, because when a person is too comfortable and too full of themselves, the gates have a very, very hard time opening. So a person has to be, and if you think about it in the world of recovery, the way this is discussed is that a person knows they have a bad habit or a bad addiction. They know it's destroying their life. They know it's destroying their family, and yet they're not willing to change because the gates are blocked. The only way that changes, sometimes they have to hit rock bottom. And when they hit rock bottom, what happens is the pain, unfortunately, is so great of their unhealthy state, the realization it really hits them really hard how bad the situation is. And when they're broken, then the gates are able to be open. Now, we don't have to wait for life to do that to us, but sometimes through a process of contemplation about how unhealthy our current state of being is, we need to be broken enough about how unhealthy our state is to open that gate. Pharaoh had the same problem. Pharaoh knew his country was being destroyed by the plagues. He knew logically it made more sense to let the Jewish people go. It was self-destructive to be addicted to this power of holding and abusing the Jewish people. He had to be broken through 10 plagues in order to allow himself to get it and say, okay, I get it now. It's time for you to leave, to go. So sometimes it requires humility and the realization of how unhealthy our current state is. As long as we're comfortable and we're willing to, as long as we're willing to tolerate the status quo, it probably won't change. When it becomes intolerable, then those gates open. So hopefully that clarifies a little bit. Not the focus of this class, but at least something for us to contemplate on. Any other questions? Okay, so I'm going to mute everyone. And again, if you have more questions, we'll unmute again a little bit later. Okay, so continuing on this process, we said that history, we understand it to be a journey, a continuum of leaving Egypt and breaking through restrictions and limitations as individuals, but it's also about mankind and the world as a whole, and to move ourselves to a place of a more enlightened and a more spiritually uplifted place. And this is the reason, again, why we mention and we celebrate Passover. We mention the Exodus all the time, because this is our personal journey. This is the journey where we are on. Interestingly, as we've mentioned and highlighted before, this is why when you read the Haggadah, when you read the Passover passages at the Seder, and you read about the Exodus, one of the glaring omissions is the fact that the main character of the story is left out. When you read the Passover Haggadah, you realize that it does not mention the name Moses. His name is omitted, which is strange. How could you tell the story of the Exodus without mentioning the main character, without mentioning Moses? And the answer for that is because we don't want people to think that this story of Passover is about something that happened thousands of years ago, that we are just recounting now. The reason we don't mention the name Moses is because you are the Moses in this story of Passover. When you sit at the Passover Seder, the Haggadah wants you to be the Moses. It wants you to look at your life and to look at the restrictions and limitations and to think about how you're going to be lifted up and lifted out. And not to go into it now, we don't have the time now, but really every single step of the Seder and everything we do at the Seder, from eating the matzah, drinking the 4 cups, the leaning that we do at the Seder, all of that has Kabbalistic symbolic meaning about that is part and meaningful and guides us through our own personal step-by-step journey out of Egypt. And again, this is because it's a present tense Exodus, which again, in his history, in many ways begins when the Jews leave Egypt and break those limitations and those shackles and receive the Torah at Mount Sinai. That process is a continuing process. It's a continuum that which we continue to be on, with this vision of a much brighter and much more enlightened future. This is the way that Judaism and Kabbalah understands our history. So though on the one hand it is, yes, a continuum, generally speaking, and it's all part of the same process, but Kabbalah sees 2 main steps in this journey. The first step is, before one is knowledgeable and before one is inspired and enlightened, one sometimes has to do the right thing, and one has to get up and break out of bad habits and limitations, not necessarily because we're inspired or enlightened to do so, but just because we believe this is what needs to be done. This is the right thing. This is what needs to be done. For example, if you think about raising a child and you're educating a child to do the right thing, we can't always wait till a child has enough knowledge and has enough appreciation and maturity to appreciate and to be inspired to do the right thing. So for example, when it comes to your child's education, when they're in 3rd grade or 4th grade, and I have children in many of those different grades, from preschool all the way through college level, but the younger children in preschool, elementary school, they're not necessarily mature enough and don't have enough information and not enlightened enough to appreciate how important education is and how important knowledge is. They would much rather spend their time playing video games. So sometimes as a parent, we have to tell the child, you need to do this because it's the right thing to do. You may not want to, you may not appreciate it, you may not be inspired, but this is something you need to do. It's the right thing to do. And this is not only about our children, sometimes about ourselves. Not always are we inspired, not always are we transformed and enlightened to a place where we're doing things because of that sense of inspiration and enlightenment. Sometimes we're not in the mood, sometimes we're not in the zone, sometimes it's just something that we don't appreciate. But it's important that we do it anyways. It's something that needs to be done, right? Imagine if you tell your boss at work, if you work for a company, I'm willing to do everything here in this company only when I'm feeling kind of excited and inspired. Then I'm going to do my job. That doesn't work. Sometimes you just have to do what you've got to do. You just got to do the right thing, right? I always say, like in a marriage, if a person, a husband or wife, tell their spouse, honey, I will do anything for you as long as I'm feeling inspired and it makes me feel good. That's not going to work. That doesn't work. We've just got to do what we've got to do. It's a sense of discipline. It's a sense of just doing what needs to be done. That is the initial stage. That is before we're knowledgeable, before we're inspired, before we're transformed. It's that first step. We're told that when the Jews were in Egypt, they were spiritually on a very, very low spiritual level. They were not very knowledgeable. They were not very inspired. In fact, it says that they had become almost pagan in Egypt. They were idol worshippers, just like the Egyptians were on many levels. They had sunken, it says, actually to the 49th level of impurity, not quite the 50, but the 49th level of impurity. They were just hanging on by a hair. They were right at the bottom. So they were not knowledgeable. They weren't inspired, but they just knew we got to get out. We've got to get out of Egypt. We got to get away from, not only get away from Egypt physically, but mentally, emotionally, spiritually. This is an unhealthy state. We just got to go. That's what they, and in fact, we're told why they had to leave in such a rush. When you are inspired, when you're transformed and enlightened, you can take your time because you are in a place where you know what you want to do and you're inspired to do so. But when you're not inspired to do so, when you're not transformed, when you're not knowledgeable, you sometimes just have to go and go now, because who knows what the next moment is going to bring, which is why actually when you read the story of the Exodus, we know that their leaving Egypt happens very quickly. In fact, so quickly, they don't even have enough time for the dough to rise. They don't have enough time for the bread to rise. It remains matzah. Of course, there's a lot of deeper meaning to the matzah being humility versus the bread being puffed up and being ego. And you have to sometimes, while you're still feeling that sense of humility, rush, get out, go out now. The people have to leave quickly because, again, they were not in an enlightened, transformed state. That's the beginning of this journey. And the idea is we first have to do the right thing, get out of the bad habits, start doing the right thing, and then begins a process of not the discipline, but a process of transformation. Transformation happens when we learn, we gain understanding, we gain perspective, we gain maturity. And that maturity, learning, and understanding slowly but surely transforms us emotionally. We changes how we feel, we become more inspired, enlightened, and then we do things not because we have to, not because we're forcing ourselves to do it, we do it because we want to do it. We don't, right? That's how I always say that if your child's in medical school and you're calling them in medical school and telling them, if you study for your test, I'm going to buy you a toy, and you're bribing them to still do their studies, and then at that time, you've lost it. If they're not inspired enough, if they're not committed enough, and if they're not transformed enough to know that this is important for themselves, they need to do this for themselves, it's not going to work at that point in time. In other words, at some point in time, we have to become inspired, knowledgeable, inspired, and enlightened enough to be transformed into a different kind of person. So really, when we talk about this journey out of Egypt, we're talking about two basic steps. First, do the right thing, even if you're not inspired, even if you're not feeling it, even if you're not understanding. Just get up and do the right thing. That's the first step. Then we want to go to a place of learning, knowledge, and transformation and inspiration, that we do things not because we have to or being forced to, in a sense. It's being imposed on us. We're doing it because we appreciate it. We're doing it because we want to do it. In Kabbalistic terminology from the Zohar, which is written actually in Aramaic, the words that are used for this, it uses two terms. In the first step, it calls it itkafya, which again, I'll have a worksheet at the end, which I'm going to share at the end. You'll see these words. Itkafya means discipline, doing what you need to do, what's right, without the knowledge, without the inspiration, just doing what you have to do it, or as Nike says, just do it. That is itkafya. And then there's the next level called ithapcha. They sound similar. Ithapcha means to transform, to turn it around. Transformation. Transformation means I've learned, I understand, I'm inspired, I'm enlightened, my emotions have been transformed. I do this because I want to do it. And that these are the two stages. And in Kabbalah, it says that actually the way our day spiritually is structured is the same way. When we wake up in the morning, our natural sense is we are naturally aware of ourselves. We wake up in the morning, we say, I'm tired, I got to press snooze, or I need my coffee. What's going to happen to me today? How is my life going to be? What are the people in my life going to say or do for me today? We are naturally, biologically and naturally self-oriented beings. That's our natural state. Very few people wake up in the morning and their first thought is, I want to totally let myself go and be totally transformed into a godly being, and I want to serve others and so on and so forth. Our natural sense is more self-oriented. As we wake up and we begin the process of learning and understanding and reflecting and meditating as we begin our day, we can transform ourselves. But first thing in the morning, we sometimes have to just do what we have to do the right thing. Get up and take time to meditate. Take some time for reflection. Take some time for prayer, for study. We don't necessarily aren't inspired to do so. We do it because we have to do it, or because we know it's the right thing to do. And then through the process of learning, through the process of meditation, through the process of prayer, or whatever it may be, and introspection and reflection, which we should take the time to do every day, we can transform ourselves on some level to be inspired. It's a process of transformation. So again, every day, so to speak, has the first moments of the day where it's more about itkafia, discipline, doing what you've got to do the right thing. And then we move from there into the itzhapcha, which is more the transformation and lifting ourselves up. So I'm going to unmute to see if there's any questions, and we'll continue after that. So any questions at this point?
Could you say the word for transformation again? I'm just taking, I know
Right.
it's going to be on the handout, but.
Okay, the word for discipline is itkafya, I-T-K-A-F-Y-A would be the way I would spell it. And the word for transformation is hithapcha, I-T-H-A-P-C-H-A. And again, that'll be on our worksheet at the end of the handout. I'll share at the end on the screen. Any other questions?
Rabbi, I've been thinking as I'm listening to you speak, I'm just thinking about Yom Kippur nonstop. I mean, you're giving this, and this is right before Pesach, but my mind just keeps going to Yom Kippur and how this, obviously this thing just carries throughout the entire Jewish year.
Correct. It is I think really, if you, Yom Kippur is a day of tremendous reflection and a day in which we really try to transform ourselves. So there's definitely those themes. I think you can find these themes throughout the whole year, which is why every single day of the year in our prayers, we recount the Exodus, because this concept of this Exodus, this concept of this spiritual journey, which again, as we're saying now, has these two basic stages, of course, many others, but two basic steps. First, discipline, and then transformation is something you're going to find a lot of these themes in every single one of the holidays. They're going to be mirrored, and they're going to be reflected in many of these days. Other questions?
Rabbi, we were at such a low place when we were slaves in Egypt, spiritually. It kind of makes me think of today, where some of us are as well.
I think
Some of us are lower than others, but what made us deserving of being taken out and being made into the people we are?
Just the very willingness that we want to go. In other words, the merit they had was nothing more than, let's go. I'm ready to do what I have to do, even though I'm not spiritually enlightened and spiritually uplifted and inspired, but I know this is what needs to be done. Let's go. The willingness to go. Right? Sometimes when you ask, sometimes you're dealing with a student, that doesn't have a lot of knowledge and so on and so forth, sometimes just their willingness to learn is enough for you to say, let me teach you, let me help you. Just because you're willing, just because you're open to it. That's all they really had, is the faith and the simple faith, and to say to God, let's go. We want to take this journey. We want to be free. We want to be better. We want to get out. We don't know what that looks like yet. Not inspired. We're not uplifted, but let's go. That itself was the merit that they had.
Maybe it was their rock bottom.
That is, yeah, that is true. That's what it says. Okay, other questions?
I have one.
Yes.
Respectfully, so can people that are really kind of stuck in their religious dogma, like just their way of thinking, I'm just saying, you know,
Yeah.
like this is how we've always done it, this is how I think, this is how I do, can that be a block to growth, or is that something that you want to attain?
Absolutely. I think anyone who is in any way blocked and in any way constricted and not open to listening and hearing other perspectives is limited. So the concept that there's only one way, or there's only one way to approach truth, or there's only one truth, there's only that God can only be served in one specific way, and so on and so forth. There's only one way to live itself is the ultimate blockage and the ultimate sense of ego and limitation that has to be broken out of. And this is a reoccurring theme throughout all of, in fact, it says that the story that the Torah tells before the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai, before the Ten Commandments, is the story about an outsider, Jethro, who's not part of the Jewish people, coming from the outside and giving his advice, and the Jewish people and Moses being open to saying, you know what, maybe they've got a point. Maybe there's something this individual sees that we don't see. We may not have all the answers. And only once they're willing to be open to an outsider's view and another perspective does God say, now you're ready to receive the Torah. But if you're dogmatic and you can only see your tunnel vision, you can only see one perspective, and you can't understand the multiple paths to God, then there is no way for you to receive the Torah. I've always said the same thing as well about how you treat other people, that the way, and this is related, the way you know that your God is man-made is if he hates the same people you do.
That's right. I remember you saying that, yeah.
Right? That's what it is. When your God hates the same people you do, then he's a man-made God. It's not man made in God's image, you've made a God in your image.
Right.
So absolutely, we have to be open to all different perspectives. Obviously, sometimes if we may not understand a certain perspective, or we may not feel that a certain perspective is something that we can relate to or agree with, that's okay. We can at least be open to hearing it and seeing a different perspective, and sometimes learning things from others, which the Torah is replete with stories of Jewish people learning tremendous lessons and God teaching us great lessons from our Gentile neighbors, from our non-Jewish neighbors, and so on and so forth, and from different paths and different perspectives. Okay, any other questions? Okay, so we will continue on this journey. We'll open up for more questions soon. Okay, so again, we have this continuum, this journey out of Egypt. It's a daily journey, but as we said in this continuum, the two major steps, the discipline, it's kafia, where you're not inspired, you're not knowledgeable, you're not feeling it, you're not lifted, you're not enlightened, but you do it anyways. And then the next step, where through knowledge and through education and through meditation and through reflection and introspection, we are able to get to a place of an inspired state, an emotionally uplifted state, which is, of course, what the goal is. And in this process, conventional wisdom, as we said at the beginning, is that the goal is the second step, the transformation. That's the higher state of being, because I've got now the knowledge, I've got the information, I've got the inspiration to be doing things because I want to do them, because I'm uplifted. And that is our goal. And so when we speak about spiritual success or a spiritually successful journey, it should be one, we would assume, where what we're waiting for, what we're trying to achieve is that enlightenment, that knowledge, that transformation, that inspiration, that we're doing things out of us in a space because we want to, because we're uplifted, we're inspired to, and that this knowledge and information has enlightened us and lifted us up to change the way we live. And this is the ultimate goal in this process. Now, what Kabbalah, and this is the curveball, this is where things get with the twist in this plot, so to speak. Kabbalah says that, yes, it is true. It is true that is the general conventional wisdom, and that is the general process. First, the lower level of just doing it because you have to. You don't know, you don't understand, you don't feel, you're not inspired, you're not enlightened, but you just do it. And the second stage and the higher stage is that transformation, which is really the difference between leaving Egypt initially as the Jews left, to what we envision the future redemption will look like, what the future world will look like, a more enlightened and transformed place where things come because that's what come from a place of enlightenment and transformation. But there is, and this is the key to this class today, so there is one, so to speak, advantage, or there is a certain quality in the first stage that in some ways is even greater than the second stage. In the stage of discipline, that is even greater than the stage of transformation. There is a certain unique quality that is greater there. To explain what I mean, in the Tanya, which is the seminal book of Chabad Hasidic philosophy, Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi quotes from the Talmud an interesting quote that says there are 4 types of people. We talk about 4 sons in the Haggadah, but he says in the Talmud, it talks in general about 4 types of people. Who are the 4 types of people? He says there is the saint, there is the evil person, or the unsaintly person. You have the saint, the person who's not a saint, and then you have the person who is a servant of God, and one who serves God, or one who does not serve God. And so he asks that this statement from the Talmud seems to be mentioning 4 different types, but it seems to be repetitive. It seems to be just 2 types, the one who's righteous and the one who's not righteous, which is the same as the one who serves God and the one who does not. And so the Tanya explains that no, there are 4 different types of people. You have righteous people and not righteous people. But even in the righteous people, you have 2 types of righteous people. The 2 types of righteous people is the one who's serving and the one who's not serving. What does he mean by that? He says, when someone is righteous, but their righteousness comes naturally to them, in other words, their goodness comes naturally to them, and they are naturally good because they are enlightened, because they're inspired, because they are uplifted, they want to do good, and goodness just is what they do, then this is not really serving. This is just being themselves. There's nothing in their life right now where they are going above and beyond their natural limitations. You know, there is a concept, for example, that we say that if you want to ask someone to work overtime, you can't just pay them regular. What do you have to pay for overtime? You have to pay double, you have to pay more, because you're asking someone to go beyond their comfort zone, right? We know, for example, when you're doing physical exercise, if you do your daily routine that you do every day, that's not where you really break yourself. That's not where you really go. It's when you go beyond what you've been doing. When you have to push yourself a little further, that is when you have to transcend that which comes naturally. That is when you really have to work hard. And that's when you really, in a certain sense, are making a statement about your commitment. In other words, it is going beyond that which is natural. In the Tanya, he gives the example. He says, there used to be a taxi service in the desert that used to use camels. And it went like this. For 100 miles, you paid $100. If you went to the ride 100, if you want to go 101 miles, just 1 mile more, it costs $200. For that extra mile, just another $100. Why? Because you were asking the camel riders to go beyond what they usually did, their natural comfort zone. It is going beyond what comes easily. And so what the Tanya is saying is that you can have someone who's righteous, but if they're only doing what comes to them naturally, which is all wonderful, good things, then in a certain sense, in a certain aspect, they are not really serving. They're not making a statement about their commitment because they're doing what comes to them quite naturally. It's wonderful, it's beautiful, but there is no space in which they've gone beyond their natural their natural habits and what comes to them easily and naturally. Or for example, if you think about 2 students in a class, one student may be a genius, and for them to get 100 on a test, they ace it without any effort. And then you have another student in the classroom that really struggles with learning. And for them, they usually get a 50 on a test. For them to get a 60, they got to really work really hard. In a certain sense, that 60 has more value than the 100 that the genius child gets, because that came easy. That's natural. So really, it's that space where we have to go beyond which comes easily to us and naturally to us, that we really define our commitment. For those of you that took our course on prayer, we talked about the concept that in prayer, sometimes when we pray, we're inspired. And sometimes when we pray, we're kind of uninspired. We're not in the zone, but we do it anyways. And in some ways, when you pray, when you're not inspired and you just do it anyways, in some ways, there's a greater expression of your commitment and your relationship with God than when you pray when you're inspired. And the example we gave is, imagine sometimes, you know, when you talk to your spouse, you can have a date night, and you can have a very, very intimate, romantic evening, and you can have a very intimate conversation, a very intimate and deep conversation. And sometimes you're in the middle of work, you're in the middle of everything is going on in your life, you're very busy, you're very distracted, and your spouse calls you, and you're really under a lot of pressure, you're very nervous, you don't have the time, and you're not inspired at that moment to have an intimate, deep, romantic conversation, but you stop everything and you say, yes, honey, how are you? Yes, dear. And you take a few moments to talk. Even though you're not in the zone, in some ways, that is more of a reflection and more of an expression of your commitment than when you have that intimate conversation, that notwithstanding the fact that you're not inspired now, notwithstanding the fact that you're not in the zone, you still took the time to relate to and to acknowledge that person. In some ways, that's a greater expression of commitment. So coming back to what we were saying before about those two steps, that true, we want to be inspired and we want to be enlightened and we want to have knowledge and we want to be in a place where we're transformed spiritually. But we also have to understand that in that first stage where we're not inspired, we're not knowledgeable, and we have to really fight hard to do the right thing, not just because it is the right thing to do, not from a place of joy, of being inspired and being transformed, and we are emotionally enjoying this. We're doing it totally out of a sense of, this is my commitment. I'm committed to this. And in some ways, there's a deeper expression of commitment. It's a harder, we have to dig deeper to do that than to do things when we're doing it out of a place of, I'm inspired, I want to do it. It's not that hard for me. I enjoy doing this. I get my high from doing this. So when we do this, when we do certain things from an uninspired state, from an uninformed space, from an unenlightened space, in some ways, there's a greater expression of commitment. There's a greater sense of discipline. There's a greater sense of digging deep within ourselves to do it anyways, that in some ways is a greater commitment and a higher spiritual expression. We have to dig deeper than when we are enlightened. So yes, our goal is enlightenment. Yes, our goal is knowledge and transformation to change who we are, so we do things because we want to do them, because we're transformed. But we should never forget and underestimate the impact and the power and the meaning and significance of doing things when we're not inspired and doing them anyways. In some ways, that's a greater expression of our commitment to truth, our commitment to what is right. It means we have to dig deeper. It is harder. It is something that we have to dig deep within ourselves to say, I don't want to do this. I don't feel inspired to do this, but I know it's right. I'm going to do it anyways. In some ways, that's more meaningful. And so why this is important is because we should never, ever feel that because we're not in a space that we're transformed and inspired, that means that my spirituality is lacking or is missing or there's no spirituality there. Doing things because you have to do them, because it's the right thing to do in some ways, is a great spiritual achievement. It may not be the ultimate goal, but it has certain unique qualities that can only be found when we do things because we have to do them out of a sense of discipline. So we shouldn't feel that my life is lacking, or if we're lacking that sense of inspiration, we're not feeling enlightened and inspired, we should know that that state also has advantages. It also has spiritual meaning. It also has spiritual blessings. And that as we go through our journey, to cherish that, to understand the significance of that. It's interesting that according to what we read in the Haggadah, if you read carefully in about the third or fourth paragraph of the Haggadah, it mentions that even when the Messiah will come in the future, we will continue to discuss and tell the story of Passover. And the question is why? If we're reaching a higher state of redemption, why would you want to remember the early redemption? It's like Imagine a team. I know there's not much sports, and I don't want to rub it into those sports fans now, but just to remind you, there used to be a world of sports. And imagine a team has just won the World Series. Baseball, they just won the World Series. And as they're throwing the champagne around and they're dancing and everything, they talk about how wonderful that spring training game was. Why would you talk about a spring training game when you just won the championship? Why would we want to mention the redemption from Egypt after the Messiah comes, when in the future redemption, in a future much more enlightened time? And the answer is because that leaving of Egypt, of doing it when we weren't inspired, there is a certain unique quality there. There is a certain unique advantage, and there is a certain unique expression of commitment and discipline that you can't have when you're transformed and inspired. And so this is what it's important to understand, and what the Kabbalah wants us to know, is that sometimes just doing the right thing because you need to do it, not because you're inspired and transformed, in some ways that has an advantage, and in some ways it's a very spiritual state and a very spiritual place to be. And you don't need to be very inspired. In fact, by definition, it's when you're not inspired and when you're not knowledgeable and when you're not enlightened and you do it anyways, that has certain unique qualities, and all of us can do that. You don't have to have a lot of knowledge to do that. Yes, there is a goal to learn, to transform, but never to underestimate the importance and the significance and the spiritual advantage of doing things just out of a place of it's kafia, of a sense of discipline. I'll unmute and take questions. Questions? Any questions? Okay, what I'm going to do, if I may, is I'm going to bring up the sheets, the review sheet, and we'll look at that. We'll see if there's any more questions after that. So you should see on your screens in a moment. Okay, everyone should see on their screens, Kabbalah Cafe, lesson 285. Are we seeing that?
Yes.
Celebrating not being inspired. This is what this class is about, celebrating not being inspired. In the Torah, we find the present tense used in describing some of the events of the Exodus. Egypt is not just a country and an ancient empire that enslaved the Jews. Egypt in Hebrew comes from the word limitation. The journey of life is one of breaking out of the habits and attitudes and behaviors that limit us and enslave us. Judaism sees the history of our world as a journey to break out of human limitations and to reach a higher enlightened state. This process begins when the Jewish people leave Egypt and culminates with a future more enlightened time. There are two critical steps in this process. First, we must do what is right even before we are inspired or enlightened. This is called itzkafia, discipline. And then we must work on education and inspiring ourselves to do the right thing, which is called itzhapcha, transformation. Transformation may be the ultimate goal, but there is a unique quality and commitment expressed in the service before we are inspired. We should not see our lack of enlightenment and inspiration as a failure. Spiritual growth means working on both aspects. And this is, again, something I didn't mention before. When we talk about spiritual growth, we want to work on both. Sometimes not being enlightened, not being inspired, and doing it anyways, we got to work on that aspect. And at the same time, we got to work on transformation. We got to work on learning, being inspired, being enlightened, and being transformed. So we do things because we want to do them, not because we have to. And again, both of those are important. Both of those have unique qualities. And spiritual growth means working on itzkafia, the discipline, and itzhapcha, the transformation. So again, we will, I'm going to stop the share on this. And I will take any additional questions that anyone may have.
Can you send that piece of paper, email?
I will try to do that, yes.
So it strikes me that what you've said is a little bit of an indictment and what I see as more modern educational trends to make everything fun, exciting, and interesting, rather than you just have to learn certain things because they have to be learned.
I think, I'm not saying one is bad or one is good. I think there's room and an important thing for both. There is a place for both in life. We want to, of course, we would like to make everything fun and wonderful, but life by definition is not always going to be that way. No human being will succeed in life if they only do things when they want to do them and they feel good about it. It's not that life can't work that way, because we're not going to always feel good. We're not going to always feel enlightened. Sometimes we have to be, it's a sense of discipline and commitment. And that is a critical piece in a mature and a successful human being. And so we need to work on both. And I can't speak about the modern education system. I'm not necessarily an educator, but I would say that, yes, we want kids to enjoy, we want them to learn and to be transformed, but we also want a sense of commitment, discipline, doing what needs to be done sometimes, and to understand and appreciate the value in that, that sometimes that means so much that I've had to dig so deep to do it, even though I don't want to, even though I don't feel inspired. I'm doing it anyways because I'm committed. It's a deeper expression of commitment. Other questions?
Well, I have something very quick, Ben.
Sure.
What about the one word that you have not used is guilt? And if we're trying to become transformed, if it's the guilt because we know we should do it, but we don't want to do it, but that's what's pushing us and motivating us, is that, I don't know whether to say, is that acceptable, or is that, I mean, to me, that's the word that keeps coming to mind, is guilt, because frequently there are things that we know we should do, we don't want to do, and then we feel guilty. And I'm not sure how to balance that.
Right. So that's a very, very good question. Guilt can be, there's two ways that guilt can mean either we're depressed about our current state, or it means that we're bitter enough about it that we want to change it. So if it's a matter of being bitter about our current state, that we're bothered by it enough that we want to change it, that's a positive thing. That's a good thing. And that's a wonderful thing that needs to be used. If we're talking about guilt in the sense of being depressed about who we are or who we were, and that guilt holds us back and weighs us down, that's something we need to get rid of. It's interesting, in the Torah reading this past Shabbat, which we didn't get a chance to do, it says that on the altar every morning after they burnt the sacrifices, it was a daily service to remove the ashes. They had to remove the ashes. And Kabbalah explains that the daily sacrifices means our daily service to get closer to God. In Hebrew, the word for sacrifice, Karban, means to get close. It's about getting closer to God. And sometimes when we get closer to God, we deal with guilt, and maybe negative guilt about our past or things that are not in order in our life. And that's what the ashes represent. The ashes represent death, destruction. And what's important is sometimes in spiritual growth, there is some elements of that guilt, but we have to make sure that it's used only to help us grow. After that, we wipe it off the altar. We have to remove it. We are not supposed to, we have to throw the baggage away. We cannot allow past negative things to hold us back. They can inspire us to grow, and that's what they're there to do. But after they've done that, there's no purpose in going back. And in fact, we have to understand God made us to make mistakes. That's how he designed us. He designed us to make mistakes and to learn from them. That was written in when God wrote the program called Humanity. He wrote a computer program called Humanity. When he wrote that program, he wrote into the program, they will make mistakes. And hopefully they will have the courage to learn from those mistakes and then move on. So we don't have to continue to hold on to this, because this is the design. You make it, you learn from it, and then you move on. And that's the way it's supposed to be.
I always think of Lot and Mrs. Lot when they left Sodom and Gomorrah,
Right.
And how she didn't want to give up looking back. And
Yeah,
I
that's the
see
story.
that many times in people when they want to hang on to the things that they have no control of.
Right.
Or things
And when
that happened.
when she looked back, she became a pillar of salt. She became very
Right.
bitter.
Right. And it happens to us now when we still hang on to things that
Yes.
have already happened.
Yes.
So that's
We
a
need
good
to
thing.
learn, we need to grow, but it's not, any other questions?
One.
Yes, Liz.
What night do we begin to count the Omer?
Good question. Okay, very good question, because counting the Omer is actually when you move from the discipline of let's just get out of Egypt, we got to break out because it's the right thing to do, to slowly but surely transforming ourselves through those 49 days where we transform the 49 emotions. So that begins on the second night of Passover. So after nightfall, on the second night of Passover, when you're doing your second Seder, at some point in time, after nightfall, you begin counting the Omer. And of course, we do that each day. Each day is connected to a different sub-emotion. There's wonderful things online you can find about that. Every night, a different sub-emotion that we reflect on, work on, and try to grow and work through that transformation process as we leave, after we've left Egypt. I do want to mention also, anyone who wants to join, I've sent out emails. There is a Zoom do-it-yourself workshop that I and Chani will lead tonight. Chani and I will lead tonight about Passover Seders. We'll touch upon some of the spiritual meanings of some of the things, but mostly just kind of help people make a successful, practical, and meaningful Seder this year. Many of us will be alone without lots of people around. It's going to be a little bit more about focused on digging within ourselves and making it very meaningful and spiritual. Okay, any other questions?
What time tonight?
Tonight, the Zoom meeting is at 7 p.m.
Thank you.
7 o'clock. If you, maybe someone can send you the link, because there is a link for that.
I'll do that for you.
Okay, perfect. That'd be great. Okay, I thank you everyone for being here today. Thank you for what I'll do actually is I'm going to put back up. I'm going to step away from the camera, but I'm going to put back up the worksheets. Any other questions before I leave?
Thanks, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to put up that screen so everyone can see that screen, and if you want to look at it again, and then I'll step away and you can continue to look at that. Okay, so that's the worksheet for today. Everyone have a wonderful day, a wonderful week.
Can you
as
post
well.
that
Thank
so
you.
that we could download it maybe?
I'd have to email it to you. That's the only way I could get it out. But you can look at it now, take a picture of it on your phone as well. That's another thing you could do.
That's a good idea.
Amazon on selfie mode.
It goes all the way to the bottom.
All right. Bye.
Thank you. Is Marge still on? Okay. I was gonna say, okay.
מכת בכורות. The corno, the corno.